I had not intended to remain for more than a week. Yet, the silent glances Peter directed at me among the peculiar tension permeating the home compelled me to stay longer. Initially, I dismissed it as inconsequential. Perhaps it was merely my daughter's fidgety disposition or Peter's subdued observance that piqued my curiosity. However, there was an unmistakable undercurrent, a growing tension as Peter exhibited attentiveness that Lydia had never shown. He would notice when I was preoccupied, his gaze lingering just a fraction longer than socially acceptable. We exchanged glances over coffee or in the kitchen window's reflection while Lydia, my beloved daughter, perpetually distanced herself, ensnared in her ceaseless obligations and deadlines. I found myself pondering whether she perceived the underlying dynamics or if she simply placed too much trust in her husband and mother to question further. On a warm autumn evening, she departed abruptly due to a last-minute call, leaving us alone at the table. Barely out of the room, Peter gazed at me with a warmth I had not experienced in years. In that fleeting silent exchange, the distinction between family and an unarticulated sentiment subtly blurred. I resolved that it would conclude there. I convinced myself that any attraction between us was innocuous, dismissing it as mere imagination. However, a singular moment, a fleeting glance, transformed everything in ways I could not have anticipated. The air was brisk as I disembarked from the train, tightening my coat around my shoulders. It had been nearly a year since I last encountered Lydia and Peter in person and a lifetime since I resided at their home. Lydia, my sole offspring, had consistently exhibited a strong sense of independence, establishing a life with Peter that appeared to require nothing from me, a fact I valued. However, recently her calls had increased, and she sounded weary and exasperated. "Even just come stay with us for a while, Mom," she had urged, a nuance in her voice that I had not previously detected. When Peter greeted me at the station, I observed a transformation in him as well. He appeared older, as if the year had imposed an imperceptible burden upon him. I attributed it to the pressures of his profession as a civil engineer, characterized by extended hours, intricate plans, and site inspections. His greeting was warm yet restrained. The customary politeness I had grown accustomed to remained, but there was a hint of something elusive in his gaze, imbued with a subtle intensity one could not identify. "You look wonderful, Vivian," he remarked as he took my suitcase. "Flatterer," I said, feeling a flush ascends to my cheeks. The journey from the station was tranquil. The dialogue was superficial. Peter occasionally glanced in my direction, perhaps on the verge of speaking, but refrained. Upon our arrival at the house, Lydia was on the phone, gesturing distractedly before withdrawing to her office. I was aware that her work as a business consultant occupied her time, although I had not anticipated her vanishing the moment I arrived. Peter laughed, noticing my astonishment. Lydia is now in that state, perpetually engaged in conversation, perpetually occupied. I offered him a knowing grin. She is like her father in that once she is concentrated, she becomes oblivious to her surroundings. Peter's gaze softened, and for an instant, I sensed a mutual understanding, a recognition of the somewhat solitary lives we lead. Connected to those frequently absorbed in their own concerns, as he guided me to the guest room, I sensed that familiar undercurrent once more, an awareness I attempted to dismiss. The day had settled into a routine that was reassuring in its simplicity. Lydia and Peter would depart for work early, while I relished the solitude of the mornings in the garden. Lydia frequently felt fatigued from reading and preparing meals in the evenings, prompting her to excuse herself early, while Peter and I remained at the dinner table, sipping wine and conversing. Our conversations possessed an unexpected ease and comfort. Peter exhibited insight and humor, revealing facets of himself previously unknown to me. He spoke reflectively about his work, the aesthetic appeal of the structures he contributed to, and the fulfillment derived from resolving complex challenges. I was captivated by his intellect and his meticulous approach. Occasionally, during our discussions, he would regard me with a warmth that felt profoundly intimate. One evening, as the sun set and sent elongated shadows over the kitchen, I found myself leaning in, anticipating more, while he remained in the doorway, observing me as I sliced vegetables. A profound silence prevailed. His stare exuded a subtle intensity that rendered the atmosphere denser. Vivian said in a voice almost above a whisper, "Thank you for your presence." I was unaware of how much I longed for someone to converse with. I placed the knife down, gazing at him. His words lingered between us, laden with unexpressed sentiments. "Something I was unable to identify, Peter. I am pleased to be present." I successfully suppressed the warmth in my cheeks as Lydia burst in with her characteristic exuberance. Interrupting the moment, I glanced back at the cutting board, hoping she had not observed the increasing proximity between Peter and me during the week as our bond deepened. We enjoyed tranquil mornings together. While Lydia remained asleep, we shared coffee, exchanging glances over our mugs, allowing silence to convey what words could not. There existed an unarticulated understanding, a tenderness in Peter's gaze that both reassured and disturbed me. I had not experienced such feelings in years, this subtle exhilaration at merely being acknowledged. The morning following Lydia's departure for work, I discovered Peter alone in the garden, repairing a damaged fence. He glanced up as I neared, wiping his hands on his jeans. With a sheepish smile, he remarked, "I didn't expect you to be awake this early," while staring at the sun, which was still low in the sky. "I couldn't sleep," I said, crossing my arms to shield against the early cold. We stood in silence, observing the leaves quiver in the gentle breeze. The tranquility enveloped us, evoking a sense of familiarity, as if we had shared these moments for years. Without deliberation, I reached out to remove a speck of dirt from his shoulder. My hand lingered slightly too long. When I glanced up, our eyes connected, his gaze steady and probing. "Vivian," he started, but the words faltered in his throat. I promptly withdrew my hand, clearing my throat. "I must prepare breakfast. Lydia will awaken shortly." "Indeed," he said, his voice taut. It was likely optimal that evening when I sat opposite Lydia, who appeared fatigued, her gaze scarcely rising from her plate. She and Peter had spoken hardly a few words, and the stillness between them was increasingly palpable. I wished to inquire if everything was satisfactory, if she was content, yet I refrained from doing so, not wishing to intrude. Later, when Lydia retired early, Peter and I found ourselves alone once more. This time, the attraction between us was undeniable, no longer just a coincidence. As we sat in silence, the faint ticking of the clock resonated on the wall, creating a sensation of being suspended in a moment that felt extraneous to our lives. He occasionally pondered, gazing into his glass, whether this is all there is, if we are merely destined to navigate through the monotony of daily existence and feign that it suffices. I observed him. "My heart aches, Peter. You are youthful and have tremendous potential before you. May alter." He shook his head, his expression vacant. "I am uncertain, Vivian. At times, I contemplate whether I made erroneous decisions, as I overlooked something in his gaze, seeing a vulnerability that evoked both honor and fear inside me. I intended to provide him solace, yet I saw that any action on my part would exacerbate the situation. Consequently, I remained seated with my hands clasped in my lap, acutely aware of the heaviness of his sorrow enveloping me. "I should retire," I eventually said. As I sensed my throat tighten, I acknowledged that his voice was scarcely audible. Upon rising, I felt his gaze trail after me, lingering in a manner that evoked an unusual warmth. The days merged indistinctly, each incrementally drawing us nearer through seemingly trivial interactions that cumulatively became undeniable. I felt an attraction to him, his quiet fortitude, his compassion, and indeed, his solitude, which reflected a part of myself that I had long suppressed. However, each time Lydia entered the room, the enchantment dissipated. I found myself suppressing my emotions, adhering to the boundaries I was supposed to honor. However, the more I attempted to dismiss them, the more intense the attraction grew, leading me to contemplate the extent of my willingness one evening after Lydia excused herself for another late call and Peter's hand grazed mine. His grasp for the drink, albeit a subtle move, elicited an undeniable shudder within me. Our gazes intersected across the table, and in that instant, I realized that the connection between us transcended mere imagination. The subsequent days unfolded in an uneasy cadence, an unarticulated interplay that Peter and I appeared to have inadvertently adopted. We exchanged glances over coffee, our eyes converging in a manner that suggested an acknowledgement of something deeper, something fragile and ephemeral that we both perceived yet refrained from articulating. I repeatedly reassured myself that it was a transient, innocuous sentiment that would dissipate and that the boundaries between us remained unblemished. However, with each passing day, I found myself increasingly captivated by the tranquil moments we shared, the way he listened intently, the way he seemed to comprehend me. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry, Peter materialized in the doorway. His sleeves rolled up, exuding a relaxed demeanor that I had not witnessed in quite some time. "Need a hand?" he inquired, stepping into the room. I nodded in negation, smiling. "I have been folding garments for decades. I believe I have mastered it by now," he remarked with a grin, resting against the doorframe. "The matter transcends attire. At times, companionship is just desirable." There was an element in his voice that caused my hands to hesitate, the fabric sliding from my grasp as I gazed up at him. His demeanor was composed, yet his eyes conveyed a similar subdued intensity. Something had been tormenting me since my arrival. "Peter," I initiated, but my voice faltered, overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation as he stepped closer, his eyes unwavering. "Vivian, I am uncertain. Whether this sentiment is erroneous or a manifestation of my solitude, I eagerly anticipate every moment spent in your company. You imbue this space with a distinct ambience." A portion of me wished to withdraw, to dismiss his comment with laughter and feign ignorance. Yet the reality is that I experienced it as well. The house indeed felt transformed in his presence, more inviting, somewhat diminished in solitude. I realized that he was concealing a profound emotion, one he feared to reveal, and I understood that recognizing it would alter everything. I inhaled deeply, selecting my words with precision. "Peter, I believe we are both adrift in our own manners. It may be simple to experience this sentiment when one is lacking something significant," he whispered, his voice just above a whisper, although it does not diminish its reality. At that moment, Lydia's voice resonated from downstairs, disrupting the enchantment. Peter retreated, raking a hand through his hair to regain his composure. I compelled a grin, folding the shirt in my shaky hands, urging my heart to decelerate. As Lydia entered the doorway, she glanced between us, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Did I interrupt something?" Peter rapidly shook his head, offering her a comforting smile while assisting your mother with the washing. Lydia's gaze rested on us just before she shrugged, unaware of the underlying tension. "Dinner is nearly prepared, and I felt it pertinent to inform you both." As she turned to depart, I exhaled a breath I had not recognized I was holding, exchanging a brief, somewhat contrite gaze with Peter. Whatever was transpiring between us was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal and to deny. The following morning, Lydia departed early, for a work trip requiring her to be out of town overnight. She had been planning for it for several weeks. Her enthusiasm was hardly restrained as she packed her luggage, discussing the clients she would visit and the presentations she would deliver. She scarcely acknowledged me or Peter as she said her farewell and exited through the door. For the first time since my arrival, Peter and I were unequivocally alone. The home had a distinct, calmer ambience. As if it were holding its breath with me, I occupied the day with minor duties, such as folding towels. Dusting the shelves served to occupy my hands and clarify my thoughts. Nonetheless, by nightfall, the stress had become unbearable. Peter proposed a simple meal on the patio, including a modest assortment of bread, cheese, and a bottle of wine he had reserved for a special occasion. The atmosphere was brisk. The sky transformed into gentle hues of lavender as the sun descended beyond the horizon. An atmosphere of tranquility enveloped us, creating an intimate space for just the two of us seated in the diminishing light. As we savored our wine, our dialogue deepened, delving into memories, regrets, and aspirations we had long neglected. I discovered myself revealing thoughts I had not disclosed to anyone in years, confiding in him with an unexpected sense of comfort. "Do you ever contemplate," I said, swirling my glass, "whether there exists a purpose you were destined to fulfill or an identity you were supposed to embody, which you inadvertently overlooked?" Nodded slowly, his expression contemplative throughout. "I contemplate the decisions I have made and the other courses I may have pursued, pondering whether I would be a different individual and potentially more content." I observed him, the sorrow in his eyes reflecting my own. We all experience lingering regrets, yet it may not be too late to discover something greater. He maintained eye contact, his hand extending across the table to rest softly on mine. The warmth of his touch elicited a shiver along my spine, while the subtle comfort of his presence filled the voids within me that I had not recognized as empty. Vivian murmured, his voice soft and steady. I don't know what this is, but I know that it feels more real than anything. I felt in a long time my breath hitched, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. I knew that what he was saying, what he was feeling, was something we couldn't act on, something that would shatter the lives we'd built if we let it. But in that moment, with the world falling away around us, it was hard to care about anything other than the man sitting across from me. As the night grew darker, we found ourselves sitting closer. The space between us shrinking with each passing second. I could feel his breath warm against my cheek, his hand lingering on mine, and I knew that if I leaned forward just a little, just an inch or two, everything would change. But before either of us could cross that invisible line, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the spell. We both jerked back, our hands slipping apart as we quickly stood, our faces flushed with the intensity of the moment. "Vivian, he began, but the words fell away as the front door opened and Lydia walked in. Her expression tired but content. "Surprised," she called, laughing, as she dropped her bags by the door. "The trip was cancelled last minute. Can you believe it?" Peter and I exchanged a quick, guilty glance at our unspoken moments slipping away as we turned to greet her, our smiles forced, and she didn't seem to notice, caught up in the excitement of her unexpected return. Oblivious to the tension that had filled the house in her absence, as she began recounting her day, I excused myself, retreating to the sanctuary of the guest room, where I could finally catch my breath. My heart was racing, my thoughts a jungle of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. I knew that whatever had happened between Peter and me that night had crossed a line and had shifted something irrevocably between us, and yet I couldn't bring myself to regret it that night. Sleep eluded me. I lay awake, my mind replaying the evening over and over. The warmth of his hand, the intensity of his gaze, the quiet yearning that seemed to pass between us in every glance. I knew I should feel ashamed, that I should try to put distance between us for Lydia's sake, but the thought of losing that connection, of going back to a life without that feeling, was almost unbearable. The next morning I rose, hoping to avoid both Peter and Lydia as I tried to collect my thoughts. But as I stepped into the kitchen, I found him there, his back to me as he prepared coffee. He turned when he heard me enter, his expression soft, his eyes filled with an unspoken question. "Vivian," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what happened last night, but I can't stop thinking about it." I swallowed, my heart racing. "Neither can I." Before either of us could say anything more, Lydia's voice called out from upstairs, the sound of her footsteps approaching. Peter's gaze lingered on mine for a brief, aching moment before he turned away, pouring coffee into 2 mugs as if nothing had happened as Lydia entered the kitchen. I forced a smile, trying to push the memory of the night before to the back of my mind. But I knew that whatever boundaries we tried to keep being tacked had been broken, and there was no going back. The morning after Lydia's return, the air felt thick, almost suffocating. I found myself hyper-aware of every glance and every word exchanged in that kitchen. Peter and I avoided each other's eyes, both of us acutely aware that Lydia was watching us with a casualness that felt just a little too deliberate. As the days passed, I noticed Lydia's gaze lingered on Peter and me with a subtle suspicion, as though she were picking up on something out of place. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, that she couldn't possibly suspect anything from our quiet glances and brief exchanges, but Lydia was observant, a trait she'd honed in her career. She could sense that something was wrong even if she couldn't put her finger on it. One evening as we sat down for dinner, Lydia glanced between Peter and me, her expression thoughtful. She tapped her fingers on the table absently, an old habit she'd had since childhood, a telltale sign that her mind was working. Finally she looked at me, her tone casual, but with an unmistakable edge. "Mom, have you been enjoying your stay?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course. It's been nice spending time with both of you." Peter kept his head down, focused on his food, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. "It's just you seem different," she said, her gaze sharpening. "I can't quite put my finger on it." I felt my pulse quicken, but I forced myself to maintain composure. "Different? How so?" She shrugged, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't know, maybe. It's nothing. You just seem quieter than usual, and Peter's been distracted." Peter cleared his throat, glancing at Lydia. With a strange smile, "I've had a lot on my mind, work stuff, you know." Lydia's gaze lingered on him, her expression skeptical. "Right, work." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, and I felt a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck. Lydia's tone was light, but there was an unmistakable hint of doubt in her voice, a suggestion that she wasn't entirely convinced. A few days later, Lydia asked me to join her for lunch, a rare invitation given her busy schedule. She chose a small cafe downtown, a cozy, quiet place where we could talk without interruption. I could tell by the way she fidgeted with her coffee cup and the way her eyes darted around the room that something was on her mind. "Mom," she began, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I wanted to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." I nodded, my heart pounding as I braced myself for whatever was coming. "Do you think Peter's happy?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. The question caught me off guard, and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" I endeavored to maintain a neutral expression. "Cup lately. He's been distant. I feel like he's here, but not really here, like his mind is somewhere else. I don't know if it's just work or if it's something more." The vulnerability in her voice tugged at something deep within me, a pang of guilt that I couldn't ignore. I reached across the table, placing my hand over hers. "Lydia, sometimes people go through things that have nothing to do with the ones they love. Maybe he's just dealing with his own struggles, things he hasn't shared with you yet." She nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. I just said, "I don't want to lose him, Mom. I don't know what I'd do if something happened to us." Her words struck me like a knife to the heart, and I felt a wave of shame wash over me. Here was my daughter confiding in me, trusting me, with her fears about her marriage, and I was holding on to secrets that could tear her world apart. I knew then that whatever was happening between Peter and me had to stop. I couldn't let myself be the reason her marriage crumbled that evening. I tried to keep my distance from Peter, avoiding the quiet moments that had become so tempting, so dangerous. I busied myself with tasks around the house, focusing on anything that would keep my mind occupied and my feelings in check. But despite my efforts, I found myself drawn to him, my resolve weakening. Every time he looked my way later, as I was putting away dishes in the kitchen, Peter appeared in the doorway. He watched me for a moment, his expression unreadable, before stepping closer. "Vivian," murmured, his voice above a whisper, "we need to talk." I averted my sight, shaking my head. "Peter, Lydia is already suspicious. We cannot continue this charade." He grasped my hand, his touch warm and soothing. "I understand, but I cannot pretend that this is not genuine. I cannot disregard my emotions." I shut my eyes and inhaled deeply. "Peter, we are transgressing boundaries that cannot be reversed. Lydia is undeserving of this treatment." I acknowledge his response, his voice imbued with subdued desperation. "Yet I cannot revert to the previous state of affairs. I experience vitality in your presence. Vivian, I perceive that I am now being acknowledged." His words instilled a chill within me, yet I willed myself to retract my hand, the burden of shame enveloping me like a dense shroud. "Peter, this must conclude. We must cease inflicting pain on Lydia in this manner before he is able to," he replied. The sound of footsteps reverberated along the corridor, and Lydia emerged in the doorway, her gaze sharpening as she surveyed us. "Am I intruding on an ongoing matter?" she inquired, her tone imbued with suspicion. Peter swiftly retreated, his demeanor meticulously impassive. "No, we were only conversing." Lydia's gaze rested on us momentarily before she shrugged, her face inscrutable. "I am retiring for the night." Do not remain awake too late as she walked. I experienced a surge of relief intertwined with profound guilt, aware that Lydia was observing us and beginning to perceive the escalating tension between Peter and me. I recognized that if we did not address it promptly, all our efforts to conceal the truth would unravel in the coming days. Lydia's doubts were increasingly evident. She started observing us with more scrutiny, her eyes fixating on me whenever Peter and I occupied the same space. Her inquiries were more incisive, and her tone got more acerbic, as if she were probing the limits. In an attempt to reveal the reality she perceived lurking beneath the surface, Lydia, with an inscrutable gaze, turned to me one evening at dinner and, in a seemingly nonchalant tone, said, "Have you ever felt that something is absent from your life?" The inquiry surprised me, and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. I believe that everyone has such feelings at times. She acquiesced, her stare resolved. I am curious if you are content. If you experience fulfillment. I compel a grin, the burden of her inquiry weighing heavily. Concerning me, I have experienced a fulfilling life. Lydia, I am appreciative of all that I possess. She remained silent, her eyes narrowing as she scrutinized me. It felt as if she were perceiving my innermost thoughts and emotions. The dialogue transitioned thereafter. However, the tension persisted in an oppressive quiet that loomed over us like a tempest. I recognized that Lydia's suspicions were intensifying, and she was starting to assemble the shards of the truth. I understood that if I did not terminate my association with Peter, the delicate equilibrium we had maintained would irreparably collapse. That night, I remained awake, my thoughts consumed with shame and apprehension. I recognized that my emotions for Peter were misguided, jeopardizing the life I had constructed and the bond one valued with my daughter. Nevertheless, the prospect of relinquishing him and reverting to a life devoid of the warmth and connection he provided seemed nearly intolerable. In the early hours of the morning, I resolved to depart. I would gather my belongings and return home. To avoid temptation and the suffering I was inflicting, it was the sole means to recover my relationship with Lydia and maintain the tenuous calm that persisted. However, as I started collecting my belongings, a gentle tap at my door halted my actions. I opened the door to discover Peter standing there, his eyes reflecting a despair akin to my own. He muttered, "Vivian." His voice was almost imperceptible. "Please do not depart." I shook my head, suppressing tears. "Peter, this is the one method by which I can cease inflicting pain on Lydia in this manner." He extended his hand towards mine, his touch pleasant and familiar. "Nonetheless, what is the status of our relationship? Regarding our emotions?" I gazed at him, my heart shattering. "At times, we must relinquish our desires and affections to safeguard those we cherish." He nodded, his countenance imbued with a subdued acceptance. Upon closing the door, I experienced a profound feeling of finality. With a bittersweet sense of satisfaction accompanying my choice, I saw that departing was the sole means of safeguarding Lydia. I sought to maintain the remnants of our connection. Yet, as I prepared for sleep, I was unable to dispel the sensation of relinquishing a fragment of myself, some aspect of my heart that would forever elude my possession. In the next few days, a profound quiet enveloped the home. I opted to extend my stay for a few additional days, motivated in part by guilt and in part by Peter's request, who noted that Lydia had experienced reduced stress since my arrival. However, each moment was fraught with unbearable tension. Lydia's glances became increasingly incisive, her inquiries more direct, and every utterance seemed like an examination, an attempt to reveal something that neither Peter nor I was prepared to face. One evening, shortly after dinner, Lydia abruptly declared, "Mom, I would like to speak with you privately." Peter and I. We exchanged a brief, apprehensive gaze before I acquiesced, after Lydia, into the sitting room. She shut the door behind her. "Maintain a perfectly neutral expression. Is everything satisfactory, dear?" I inquired, attempting to maintain a composed tone, as Lydia exhaled deeply and seated herself on the couch's edge, her stare unwavering. "Mom, I will no longer circumvent this issue. I am aware that something has been occurring. I observe the manner in which you regard one another and the transformation in Peter. It feels as though there is an underlying tension. The words impact me with the force of a blow to the abdomen. I attempted to articulate a response, although the words eluded me. She had noticed every inadequate effort we made to conceal our emotions. "Lydia," I started, my voice wavering. Nothing transpired. She reiterated that nothing occurred. Her voice elevated. "You assert that nothing is occurring between you and my husband." Her allegation lingered in the atmosphere. Despite my desire to refute it, the remarks resonated as vacuous. I was aware that Lydia, my astute daughter, would discern any falsehood I presented. The truth was evident in my hesitation and the tremor of my hands as I clasped them together. Perhaps I misinterpreted her words. She spoke softly, her gaze resolute. "However, I can no longer feign ignorance regarding my feelings of alienation within my own marriage." My heart shattered upon hearing those words, and when I reached out, she recoiled, a fierce determination reflected in her eyes. "Mother, I require no elucidations. I require the truth." I inhaled, my words scarcely audible. "Lydia, I sincerely apologize. I did not intend for this to occur. It is intricate." She shook her head, her face contorting with incredulity. "You are my mother, he is my spouse." The quiet between us was an abyss too vast and profound to traverse. I sought to elucidate my feelings of loneliness and the inadvertent connection that had developed. However, upon gazing into her eyes, I realized that no explanation could suffice. "I require some time for contemplation," she stated, her voice quavering. "I need to ascertain what all of this signifies for us." As she approached the door, her steps faltering just prior to her departure, she faced me, her eyes brimming with a blend of fury and sorrow. "I placed my confidence in you, and you deceived me." The door closed behind her, leaving me in the room's silence, the weight of her words overwhelming me. I sank into the couch, my heart burdened by the realization that I had irreparably damaged something. Lydia departed the following morning, hastily explaining her need for space. Peter and I were left alone, the remnants of our errors lingering between us like specters. I could scarcely meet his gaze, shame and regret tainting every exchange. We navigated the house as if we were strangers. The warmth and connection that once captivated us are now rendered hollow and devoid of meaning. One evening, Peter approached me in the tranquil living room, his countenance fatigued. "Vivian," he started, his voice laden, "I am profoundly sorry. I never intended for this to cause pain." "Lydia, I never intended for any of this to cause you pain." I gazed at him, sensing the burden. The weight of past events bears down on me. It is too late for apologies. "Peter, we were both aware of the risks we were taking." He acquiesced, his eyes averted. "I am uncertain about my next steps. I feel as though I have failed." Everything I sighed, my voice imbued with a profound grief that occasionally felt inexhaustible. "We make irrevocable decisions, Peter. Decisions that alter everything." Silence lingered between us, heavy with remorse. I recognized that the connection we had was genuine and had alleviated a mutual emptiness. However, that did not render it just, did it? Alter the suffering we had inflicted. "Perhaps it is advisable for me to depart," I concluded. "My choice is becoming increasingly firm. I believe I can no longer remain here, Peter." He did not dispute. He only nodded, his eyes far away, as if he too had acquiesced to the inevitable. I returned home, my heart burdened by the memories of the life I had destroyed. Lydia and I seldom communicated in the next few weeks. Her silence was profound, a painful reminder of the severed link. I attempted to contact her through messages and letters. Nevertheless, her replies were sparse and terse, imbued with the burden of betrayal. Time progressed at a languid pace each day. As one day merged into the next, I immersed myself in work, attempting to assuage the void with tasks and routines. Nonetheless, the pang of loss persisted, an enduring reminder of what I had forfeited one evening months after my return. I received a letter from Lydia. Her remarks were succinct and imbued with a cautious tone. I had anticipated it, yet there was a trace of something gentler, a flicker of the daughter I had before recognized, Mom. I am uncertain if I will ever comprehend the events that transpired between you and Peter, nor if I will ever attain the capacity to forgive. I am making an effort to understand you completely. I wish to think that our connection holds greater significance than a single error and that it can endure. I require time. I kindly ask for your patience. Her comments instilled in me a blend of optimism and grief. I recognized that the path to forgiveness would be arduous. The wounds I inflicted would need years to heal, yet I was prepared to wait to regain the trust one had broken. In the years that ensued, Lydia and I gradually reconstructed our relationship, piece by delicate piece. We never discussed the betrayal, yet there existed a tacit understanding between us, a silent recognition of the anguish and subsequent healing that transpired. Peter and Lydia divorced shortly after my departure, their marriage unable to withstand the repercussions of our actions. I learned through mutual acquaintances that Peter relocated to a small coastal town in pursuit of a new beginning, unencumbered by past mistakes. As for me, I discovered a renewed sense of purpose in my work, dedicating myself to the art gallery with an intensity one had not experienced in years. I channeled my emotions into my work, finding solace in the creative expression that had once served as my refuge throughout the years. I learned to forgive myself and accept the decisions I made along with their repercussions, although the memories remained a subtle anguish that would always be a part of me. I discovered tranquility in the realization of my growth and learning. I committed errors and caused sorrow to those I cherished, yet I discovered the fortitude to confront the truth, rectify my wrongs, and restore the connection with Lydia. Although it would never return to its original state, it became a genuine link, shaped by suffering and comprehension, which ultimately sufficed.